they had a Collins kilowatt single sideband, so I could talk to my wife in Baltimore. So that was nice. But we had the war surplus equipment. We had the tank transceiver radios, which could put out 50 watts. They had two 6L6s and push-pull. And you could go anywhere with those things. And then the transistors came along and changed everything. Hey, how you doing? It's getting warm out there. Spring has sprung. It's supposed. Oh, we'll have a lot to talk about. Well, it's supposed to be 72 today. It's supposed to be really nice. No, but well, she told me she may not be here, but I'm still not going to start before about a minute after, just in case she does come and she won't be able to criticize it. There will be a brief 4-year hiatus. Huh? No, 4 year, 4 years, because NIH funds a tremendous amount of research, and well, that might disappear, and the special fellowships might disappear. I was trained. Part of my training was on an NIH special fellowship, and that trained a lot of us. What can I say? Anyhow, I'll wait till some more people come in. A few more.
If you can silence your cell phones, please, that would be greatly appreciated. Zoomers, please stay muted, and you can ask your questions at the end on the chat, and I'll monitor that. And I will turn this over to Joe to start with.
Okay, well, we're going to talk today about transportation. And a lot of it we just take for granted, but we don't think about it. But when it all started out where you walked, we didn't have vehicles to take us there. And so we're limited as to where we could go. Then we rode animals like a horse or a mule, but still we couldn't go very far or very fast. And it took a while to get there. If you lived near a river or a body of water, of course, you could take a boat. And we're going to talk about some of the boats, like the rafts, because people wondered, how did people in Polynesia get there? I'm going to talk about Thor Heyerdahl. Then they figured out how to hook an animal, a horse or a mule, up to a carriage or a wagon, and so you could go a little further. And then, of course, we came to the age of the train, and we learned how to use steam, and then diesel electric, and we'll talk about the maglev, which is the current high technology for a train. And even I experienced that in China, which is one of the few places where commercial maglev is running. Then, of course, we got to talk about the automobile. The first automobiles were actually electric, and they used the lead acid batteries. They didn't go very far or very fast. And then they switched to gas, and then, of course, we have the hybrids. And then finally, the airplane. Flying cars exist, but of course they're not very widespread. And then we'll talk about the helicopter and how airplanes fly. So, wait a minute, where am I going? Oh, there we go. So, if you couldn't go very far, you stayed in one place. People in the past lived their whole lives in one place. They were isolated, so languages developed. And then people began to develop trade. The classic was, of course, the Silk Road with the camel caravans. But people, used these conveniences to trade. And then, of course, with better transportation, we had things like tourism. And then, of course, we had the archaeologists who figured out how things did and the development of other things. But if we talk about boats, first boats, of course, were rafts, and then developed canoes, and then sail, where you'd use the wind to get to where you had to go. The development of steam was a tremendous improvement because now you could aim a boat directly into the wind. You can't do that with sail. And so the first steamboats were in 1784, and then finally around 1890, they were used to cross the Atlantic Ocean. We then developed gasoline-powered boats, motorboats. The classic was the PT boats during the Second World War and some of the speedboats out there. Diesel is a much better and more efficient way to power a boat, but of course it's more like a workhorse. It doesn't have a whole lot of torque and you don't go terribly fast, but it is efficient and it is much less expensive than gasoline. Then we developed the diesel electric, and this was mainly during the Second World War where the Germans developed the snorkel. And this was simply a tube going from the sub to the surface that allowed air to go into the sub so you could run a diesel engine underwater. Then, of course, we developed the all-electric subs, and finally, atomic energy, which is used to power the aircraft carriers, and that develops a tremendous amount of power. So the sailboats are interesting because sometimes you have to sail against the wind, and that's not easy to do. You have to tack. You have to aim the boat to the side, and the sail is now functioning like an airplane wing. So you can go against the wind as long as you don't go directly at it. You have to go sort of sideways, back and forth. And if any of you have been on a sailboat, you know when you tack, you got to watch your head because that sail is going to swing back in the other direction. But with tacking, you can go against the wind and eventually get there. Now, if we talk about the types of boats, the original rafts were just that. They were, tree trunks strapped together. And the thing that's interesting was how the people got to Polynesia. And they used balsa wood rafts. And if any of you have built model airplanes, most have been here, probably have. Balsa is a very light and very soft wood, but it's a great wood because it has a low density sap and it doesn't sink. And so we had boats that were powered by rafts, and we had rowboats that the Vikings, who also used sail, but they also rowed. And then we used sail to explore the New World, and then steam came along. If you've been to Hawaii or Indonesia, you see boats with outriggers, which gives them increased stability. Then you have the twin hull boats, the catamarans, which are more stable and are able to go, into rougher water. And then finally we have flying boats, seaplanes. And it's basically just that, a flying boat. So here's the Kon-Tiki. And Thor Heyerdahl in 1947 proved that people could go from South America to Polynesia. It's 4,300 miles from Peru to Tahiti. Took him 121 days with a crew of 6, so him plus 5 other crew people. And he used balsa wood, which is presumably what the older folks used, and hemp ropes. So he tried to duplicate exactly what he felt the people way back when did. And then in 1977, he went from Iraq to Pakistan, 4,000 miles on a reed boat. And so what he proved was that people way back when could travel long distances with what seems very primitive means. So we then go from the Kon-Tiki to the hydrofoil, which is, if you've ever been on it, is a very fast boat. It has these struts coming out the side and a wing-like structure below that. And so as it picks up speed, it lifts the boat out of the water. which means you don't have the drag of the water on the boat. So there's no drag from the hull. Usually it's powered by a very powerful water pump because you can't use propellers on this thing. And it can go 45 knots. And Eve and I were on one of these things. They use them as ferries between the islands in Hawaii. And it's really quite smooth and it's quite exciting. You're enclosed because you're going quite fast. And it'll go 40 miles from one island to an island in about an hour. Well, then we go to trains. The first train, of course, was steam, and then we got the diesel. You don't have gasoline-powered trains because a diesel motor is a much more powerful motor. And then we have electric trains, and we don't think about our subway or light rail as a train, but really it is a train. Your streetcar is basically a train. And then we have the hybrids, the diesel electrics. The latest is the Magloop. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the Hyperloop, which is not as strange as it seems, and then the combination of the two to make trains go even faster. So the first train was the steam in 1804. We then switched to diesel when we could because it's more efficient, it's faster, it's cleaner, it's cheaper. And then the electric train is still more efficient. And most of the trains are diesel electric, where you have a diesel motor powering a generator, and the train actually runs off of electric motors, usually DC motors. And then finally, you have the electric train, which gets its power from overhead wires. During the Depression, the government convinced, or actually strong-armed, the Pennsylvania Railroad to electrify its line. And they did it hollering and screaming, and then years later said it was the best investment they ever made. So the Pennsylvania Railroad got electrified early on. But here's where we went from the Tom Thumb, which is the old Baltimore and Ohio locomotive, to the Santa Fe. And the difference is quite striking. The Santa Fe motor is 6,600 horsepower, and you can use multiple units. So you can get a tremendous amount of horsepower. If you visit West Virginia, you'll see trains with 100 cars full of coal, and it takes about 4 of those locomotives to pull it. So the Tom Thumb developed 1.4 horsepower, and it didn't go very fast, 10 to 14 miles an hour, but it was faster than a horse. And in fact, they had a race between the Tom Thumb and a horse. The horse won because the Tom Thumb broke a belt and never finished the race. The horse did. But the fastest steam engine speed recorded was in 1938 at 126 miles per hour. And think about it for a minute. The trains don't go that fast today. The diesel electric, as I said, is a huge monster of an engine, but it gets at 480 miles to a gallon. And apparently, once the train gets up to speed, it doesn't take a whole lot of power to keep it going. So it's a very efficient way of doing it. So how does it work? Well, from steam, you have a boiler, you have high pressure steam, which pushes a piston, and that drives a shaft, which turns the wheel. And so you have this on both sides of the locomotive. So while one piston is operating, the other is recovering, so to speak. And so they alternate one from the other. And that's how a steam locomotive works. Well, your electric uses a motor, a DC motor. You have a permanent magnet and then an electromagnet that's rotating. And by changing the polarity of the current from plus to minus, you can make that rotate. And the advantage of the electric motor is it has a tremendous amount of torque. So I've had the experience of being on steam engines and electric trains. The big difference is the steam engine starts with a jerk, as it finally gets up steam. Each time that piston fills, you get a jerk forward. The electric motor is smooth. You don't even know the train's moving. And it's that smooth. Well, the advantages are it's much cleaner than a coal-burning steam locomotive. You don't need water towers. It's much more efficient. It's much more powerful. and of course it's quieter. And those of you who've ever been on a steam train know that you have lots of cinders in the air. By the time you finish, you need to take a shower because you're covered with this stuff. Well, the new thing in trains is the maglev train. There's only a couple of them working in the world, but this makes a lot of sense. It doesn't have wheels, it floats on air because you have now superconducting magnets that are very powerful, and you can levitate a train off of a track. You have linear motors, so you have a permanent magnet in the train, and then in the side, you have magnets that can change. So you can pull or push the train so you can speed it up, or you can slow it down depending on how you pulse the electricity to these magnets. So here's basically how it works. You have, unlike poles attract, like poles repel. The magnet in the train is permanent, but on the track outside, you change the magnet. So you change from a north to a south pole depending on where you want the train to go. If you have a north attracted to a south, the train will move forward, and then when the train goes past that, you change that magnet to a south pole, so now it's repelling, but it's heading to the next magnet, which is the north pole. As far as levitating the train, you can either have the magnets at the bottom, like we did in the previous picture, or along the side to keep the train so it doesn't need wheels. And then to keep the train centered, you've got like magnets which repel, and so you keep the train from banging into the sides. So you need a guide for this. But I've been on this train from Shanghai. It goes from the outskirts of Shanghai to the Shanghai airport. That's what it looks like. It doesn't levitate very much above the ground. And you notice it has its own separate structure. So it's away from everything else. It takes about 8 minutes. So it's a short ride, and it goes 20 miles in those 8 minutes. The train that I was on moved at about 250 miles an hour. It's silky smooth, it's quiet, and when you look out the window, everything is a blur. Unfortunately, it has to go in a straight line. So those of you who are engineers know that if you take a train going 250 miles an hour and try to make it go around a curve, you got some problems. But in comparison to regular rail, there are tremendous advantages. You have very little maintenance on the gateway because nothing is moving. In other words, there are no wheels touching the rail, whereas in normal rail, you have to maintain the track, maintain the wheels, and you have to constantly keep it upgraded. The maglev pretty much is impervious to weather, so unless weather is horrible, you can run a maglev, whereas mainly the regular trains, sometimes because of weather conditions, they can't run. And then, of course, the maglev is very efficient because all you have is some air resistance, but you don't have the resistance from the wheels on the track. So there are 3 maglev trains that are commercially running. One's in Japan, started in 2005. The train I was on was in China, and that started operation in 2004. And then there's one in South Korea. So the advantages of the maglev are really quite significant. They can go at high speed. They can go much faster than the traditional high-speed trains. The ride is very smooth because they're floating basically on air. They're really energy efficient. They do require energy for the magnets, but once you get them going, they're quite efficient. And of course, they're low maintenance. You don't have anything moving or rolling or touching. Disadvantage is they're expensive. You have to have a limited right-of-way. I mean, think about it. You can't have a train going 250 miles an hour and then have a crossing, an automobile crossing. So you have to have a limited infrastructure there. And then there is some power consumption involved. The next thing we talk about is the Hyperloop. And this is basically a tube where you have a low pressure at one end and a high pressure at the other end. This is not quite as exotic as you think. If any of you have used a drive-in bank and you haven't used the window that's part of the bank, but the little station away from the bank, you put what you want to put your deposit into a cassette, you put it into a machine and push a button, and it zips along into the bank. But what's happening is it's creating a vacuum in front of that and pressure behind it. That's a hyperloop. That's all it is. It's not new technology. Those of you who can remember department stores from way back when used to have these things all the time to send stuff from one department to another. But the idea is to make it big, and you want to combine that with a maglev, where you don't have anything rolling on wheels, and you've got an aerodynamic structure. So if you do this, you can go at exceedingly high speeds. So theoretically, the fastest a maglev has run has been a little under 400 miles an hour, 387. And they figured that the previous, if you go from maglev to hyperloop and combine them, you can achieve very high speeds. Now, people are thinking outside the box. So here's what they're talking about. New York City to London, 1 hour. Well, it means you build a tunnel 3,400 miles under the Atlantic Ocean, estimated cost about $20 trillion. But they figure because you use a combined hyperloop and maglev, you could go up to 3,000 miles per hour. In other words, you're not limited by aerodynamics, and theoretically it's possible. Now, I don't think this is ever going to happen, but in theory it could. Now, if we talk about high-speed trains, any train that goes 200 miles per hour or faster is considered high speed. So you need special tracks, you need right-of-ways, and in this country, unfortunately, the fastest train we have is the Acela, which can hit 125 miles per hour in certain areas, not everywhere. And most of Amtrak trains, their max speed is 79 miles an hour. And I think we've all had the experience of on the highways going alongside Amtrak's right-of-way, and the car is going faster than the train because we'll go 80 or faster. The train isn't going that fast. Maglevs will hit 267, and the combination of the hyperloop and the maglev, they figure it could go at least 400 miles an hour. Unfortunately, it probably is not going to happen in the U.S. But other parts of the world do have high-speed trains, especially in Asia, China, Hong Kong, Japan, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Taiwan, Uzbekistan. They all have high-speed trains. And in Europe, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Norway, Russia, Serbia, Spain, Switzerland, Turkey, they have high-speed rail. And I've been on a high-speed train in Spain, and it really is a very comfortable train. They're very quiet, they're very fast, and but they do require special tracks. And in England, the only high-speed train is the one that goes from England to Paris under the Channel, under the English Channel. So to get a high-speed train, you need special track. The rails have to be welded, so you don't get the usual clickety-clack that you're used to in a train. You need a special road bed. You can't have wooden cross ties. You have the cement cross ties. You have to have a limited right-of-way. You have to limit the curves, and the cars have to be designed and made to withstand these speeds. So you need special wheels and carriages on the cars. But countries around the world are doing this, and we need to really do it in the United States. I mean, we've got two corridors. You've got your East Coast and your West Coast corridors, which could benefit greatly from high-speed rail. Well, if we go next to automobiles, the original automobile used lead-acid batteries. They were very heavy and they're very slow. We then switched to gasoline. It was much more efficient. You had the internal combustion engine. You have diesel cars, but not very many. The diesel motor isn't as zippy as the internal combustion engine, and it's used mainly for trucks. We have the hybrids where we combine both, and the real improvement was the battery. Lead acid batteries, an old technology, and we went from lead, which is very heavy, to lithium, which is very light, and increasing the power density as we did that. So battery improvement is going to be the key to electric cars. And we're going to have better batteries than the lithium battery in the near future. We're going to have the sodium battery. We'll have other batteries. We have self-driving cars as a technology that's coming, and they'll eventually get it. It's like the old days when you had a horse and buggy. If you were drunk, the horse knew the way home. Well, now you'll have a self-driving car, and you won't have to worry about it. We do have flying cars, but they're mainly for people who build them and from kits, or they're not, I don't think they're going to be for the general public. But the car has a lot of advantages over the horse. You don't need stables. People don't realize, but in cities where you had horses taking care of everything, cities stank because horses tend to leave a lot of manure on the ground. And so the cities are clean, you have easier maintenance, they're more efficient, they're faster. And then we developed the highway system. What? Okay. Is there a problem? Oh, oh, wait a minute. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Well, wait a minute. Call some of the people from, call security. They will.
Zoomers. We had a little emergency, so just bear with us. We will continue in a bit. Just hold on. Zoomers, we're finishing up on our emergency that we had here in the room, and we will continue our class in just a little bit. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
The physicians here, so that because Robert was here and having a seizure or something, and she's awake and coherent. Just stay quiet. You got time. Okay. Now we're going to need a fresh to dry a lot. That's great. Thanks for having me.
Maybe that's what I should do. Just got on my cell phone that I have over there and just called 911. Maybe I should just done that.
Oh, I see. That thing goes when. Okay. Well, well, think about it. Probably the biggest shock was the printing press because now people became literate. And, it's true the first things printed were the Bibles, but look what happened afterwards. Outside of the monasteries, only the monks were literate. Yeah, you're gonna check it. Oh, okay. Are they gonna? What you do? You better tell them about the button. So are they going? Right, but also you need the guys from security We got a bunch of old guys here, not really capable of lifting somebody up. But then again, in a situation like that, you want them to lie flat. What? Well, the electric cars were easy to drive. You know, you had very few controls, and they were all lead acid batteries then. That's true. Well, the gasoline, it was politics. It was a combination of gasoline, roads, and tires. You know, it was Goodyear, and it was economics. But then again, the electric cars used a lot of lead acid batteries. They were exceedingly heavy. And I remember that when I was younger, I was reading about electric cars, and you had a small car that weighed like close to 4,000 pounds because lead is exceedingly heavy. The reason you've got electric cars today is because you've got lithium batteries, which is exceedingly light metal. And so you have a very powerful, large battery that doesn't weigh anywhere near what the equivalent in lead acid batteries would be. And also, you have a greater power density in a lithium battery. So it's a better battery all around. Well, they do last longer. I mean, if you think about lead acid batteries, they have sulfuric acid, they vent hydrogen, they require a certain amount of maintenance. Your lithium battery is pretty much sealed. Now, you do have a problem with them, and that is they tend to burn occasionally. They tend to catch fire. And that's going to be a problem that will be eliminated with the sodium battery or some of the other batteries. The lithium batteries are a tremendous improvement, but there are better batteries coming along. The sodium is a sodium iron battery, and apparently it's not in real production. They have made it. Apparently it has a higher power density. It has better characteristics than the lithium battery. It can be sent without being charged. Your lithium batteries have to have a certain charge on them, and it doesn't have the propensity to catch flame like a lithium battery does. So it's a better battery all told, and I think eventually the lithium batteries will be phased out. Just like I think they're going to eventually, you'll see a lead acid battery in the museum. Uh, okay, so oh. Okay, well, for those of you on Zoom, thank you for waiting. We, we can
We're good to
continue
go, I
now.
think. Thank you for being patient.
Okay, thank you. So we'll continue with hybrid cars. And the first hybrid car was not the Toyota Prius. And it was a car that was built by Ferdinand Porsche. Now, all of you know about Porsches. He was one of the people involved in the development of the Volkswagen. He designed the Karmann Ghia. A young engineer in Germany, when he was 21 years old, he was asked to develop an electric car. And he did develop an electric car, which was demonstrated at the 1900 Paris Exposition. He was the engineer who figured out that you could have an electric motor on each wheel and have the whole thing run by batteries. So it really wasn't a true hybrid. It was really the first electric car. But Ferdinand Porsche, of course, went on to have a very glorious career. he's the guy who's responsible for all the Porsches. But this is something he did when he was a young engineer. And so the idea of having an electric car goes way back. Next thing we need to talk about is the airplane. And from Kitty Hawk to transatlantic service, we're talking about a span of about 50 years. So Kitty Hawk was in 1903, and the Boeing 707, the first real transatlantic jet, was 1957. And of course, the planes have gotten more powerful since then. And then we've had one supersonic plane, the Concorde. And the problem with that was it's not very efficient. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of fuel to power it. And then you have the boom caused when it becomes supersonic. So how fast can these things go? Well, the limit in physics is the speed of light, 186,000 miles per hour. That's pretty fast. Sound travels only at about 760 miles per hour, quite a bit slower. So if you're traveling a little faster than 700, you're going to cause a sound boom. Of course, the problem is you have the pollution from the electric engine, from the jet engine. And now in development, we have electric airplanes because you have solar cells, you have lightweight batteries, and you have very efficient motors. So you might be seeing electric airplanes as your commuter planes, short distances. You won't be flying one over the ocean, but you might be flying one from, say, here to Philadelphia. So the real question is, how does the plane fly? It's all in the wing. And the principle of physics is very basic. You have air flowing over the wing. The shape of the wing determines what's happening. And the airflow splits. The part that goes below the wing is in lower pressure, or higher pressure, I'm sorry. The part above the wing is lower pressure. So the result is you lift up the wing. And the faster you go, the more lift you have. Well, you know, when you go into an airplane, you're at the end of the runway, and that plane is speeding up. When it gets close to 200 miles per hour, it can now take off. There's enough lift under the wing to make that very heavy airplane go into the air. But you have airplanes that don't have wings, helicopters, and there are two types of those. The ones with the dual blades, you have one blade going clockwise, one going counterclockwise. And these are your heavy-duty airplanes, the ones that have large capacity and are very powerful. Most of the helicopters have only one set of rotating blades. And so if the blades are rotating clockwise, it tends to make the airplane go counterclockwise. So you need this little motor at the end with the propeller to keep the airplane steady. Now, helicopters are incredible devices. And this picture does not really show you all the stuff that's in the rotor blade, but the rotor is the heart of the helicopter. And what you have are the shaft that's going up to the blades, that's going to transmit the power from the motor to the blades, make them turn. You have a series of rods coming down from the blades, which control the pitch of the blade. So the blade can twist, and at higher pitch, it'll grab more air and, of course, make more lift. Then you have these two plates called upper and lower swash plates, and a bunch of ball bearings between them. The upper plate moves, the lower plate does not. And this is really how the helicopter works. So as the engine turns the rotor shaft, it turns the upper swash plate and the rotor blade system. And the control rods have a connection to the blades, making it possible to change the pitch of the blade. And so as the hub mounts to the mast, there's this thing at the top called a Jesus nut. And it's named that way because if it fails, the pilot has come to face with Jesus. That whole thing falls apart. The lower swash plate is fixed, and it has attachments which allow the whole apparatus to turn. and it can turn forward, it can turn to the side. And this is how the helicopter works. Now, the pilot has two control rods. In his right hand is what they call the cyclic. And this controls the pitch of the whole rotor assembly. So if he moves that rod to the right, the whole apparatus moves to the right, and the helicopter will move to the right. If he pushes it forward, it will go forward. If he moves it backward, it goes backward. In his left hand is a thing called the collective or the pitch. And this can only go up and down. So as he moves it up, the pitch of the blade increases, and now the helicopter rises up. If he lowers the pitch, helicopter settles down. Now, if that's not enough, he also has two foot pedals because they control the little propeller at the back of the helicopter. And so if he pushes the left foot pedal, the helicopter will rotate on its axis to the left. And conversely, if he pushes the right, they rotate the other way. Now, there's an interesting video you can watch, and it's very amusing. It's a video of young helicopter trainees, and they're learning how to hover. Now, we all know helicopters can stay in position, but it's a very, very difficult maneuver. And if you watch this video, the helicopter looks like a drunk. It's moving every which way, not very far, but it's something that the pilot has to learn how to do. And they say it's analogous to learning how to ride a bike. When you first start, you're making all sorts of mistakes, and it's difficult, and then suddenly you get it. And so every helicopter pilot has a point where he gets it. And so when you go for a ride in a helicopter and the pilot hovers, you can now appreciate the amount of training and the difficult that he had to go through to learn how to do that. It means he has to use both control rods and both feet to adjust everything in that helicopter to make it hover. Well, this is simply to show that the people who design these things have to think outside the box. This is a poster that was in the Sikorsky helicopter plant many years ago. And it says, according to proven laws of aerodynamics, because of the ratio of body size and body weight to wing area, the bumblebee cannot fly. But the bumblebee doesn't know this, so he goes ahead and flies anyway. So what's the future? Well, the future, at least the immediate future, is not teleportation. It's not like Star Trek, beam me up, Scotty. That's not going to happen for quite a while. There's a movie that came out many years ago called The Fly, where they had just that. And as the guy was being teleported, a fly got into the machinery, and he went out half fly, half human. It's a nice movie. We can't go faster than the speed of light with our laws of physics as we now know them. So interplanetary travel is going to take a long, long time. To put it in perspective, Voyager 1 has now reached the edge of our solar system. It's been out there for 50 years. That's how long it takes. So unless we figure out how to go faster than the speed of light, we're not going to be exploring planets in the near future. People talk about wormholes, about warping space-time. So far, we haven't figured out how to do it. So unless we understand more laws of physics or change physics, we're pretty much stuck here. So I hope I've given you some insight into how we get around from here to there. We've come a long way since just having feet only as a transportation system. And we take for granted all this technology. And it really is truly wonderful technology. It's very reliable and it's quite dependable. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Any questions? No?
Well, thank you very much for the people on Zoom. I apologize for the delay. Now you know more than you ever wanted to know. Oh, thank you. Okay. Yeah, Ferdinand Porsche, he figured it out. That's right. Well, what it was, was the right was the guy who made the coach for the car, a fellow named Lohner, and he decided that gasoline motors were noisy and smelly, and he wanted a car that wouldn't do that. Porsche was only 21 years old, and he figured it out. But you see, they didn't have the lithium batteries then, so you didn't have the battery power to do it. But you know, that's 1900. So, oh well, then he was ahead of his time. Oh, he, well, you know, Da Vinci invented the tank in war. He figured out a lot of stuff. They have this calculating machine he figured out. These guys were phenomenal in their ideas. They thought outside the box. And it was years before things, you know, gelled, before we had the technology. And what's interesting, when I talked about the LED, it was 30 years from the time they figured it out to the time they got them where the lights are powerful. And the same thing happened with basic research with the COVID vaccines. And the basic research had been done many years before. And when the need came, all of a sudden we had the technology to do it. And this is true of a lot of the technology where it gets, well, it's one thing to have it economically viable. Like the Concorde is not economically viable. It costs too much to run, it uses too much fuel, and people object to the sound booms. So it can only run over the ocean. Hmm? Well, yeah, I mean, you know, the military planes routinely go faster than the speed of sound. You've got the fighters get so go to Mach 3, you know, and so you got boom, boom, boom. So we've got this technology. It's a question of how you're going to use it. I used to see in popular mechanics the flying cars, where the wings folded into the car and then the wings would unfold. You could get up to speed and take off. Well, can you imagine what would happen if that was readily available? You had enough carnage on the roads. Imagine what would happen if the doggone things could fly. Well, the DeLorean, well, that was, you know, the technology in the DeLorean, that movie, is not yet there, but they have the fusion fuel. But we'll get it. But we're getting close to fusion. Okay. Per second. I'm sorry. You're right. Well, normally I would say 300,000 meters per second, but nobody knows metric. Nobody knows metric anymore. Yeah, I've got to correct that. Well, you know, in medicine we use metric only. You know, we use milligrams. We don't use grains. What it was us in England, and even England uses the metric. Oh, okay. But well, you know, your car is all metric. If you get one of these wrenches, you got to get a metric wrench. Oh, no, American cars. You need a metric lug wrench for an American car. But if I write a script, it's always in milligrams. I write you for coding at 60 milligrams. I don't even know how many grains that is. But I know. right. That's right. That's right. Well, if you remember years ago, Shell Oil tried to sell gasoline by the liter. That failed miserably. But but take these same Americans and have them go to Europe, no problem. Now, the other thing that's interesting, we have one thing here that is all metric. Booze and soda. And the reason they did it was a way of increasing the price. Your fifth of whiskey is what, 375 milliliters. Your half gallon is 1.5 liter. It's a little bit smaller. And all your sodas are in liter bottles. Liter, 2 liter bottles. And I don't know why we don't go to metric. You know, if you ever tried to use nuts and bolts, our English system is insane. Give me a 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter, 3 millimeter, 4 millimeter bolt. Don't convert, just go. Once you're on it, that's it. You're not converting. That's right. Well, you know, if they just do it, have done with it. Because everything, well, you know, they goofed. There was one of the things that go to Mars, and they got the units wrong, and it missed. You know, they're sending one of the, like an explorer type thing to Mars. It was a classic blunder, but the engineers were using English units, and they should have been using metric units. Well, it was embarrassing because you talk, these things are expensive. No, it's a mistake. You're right. You're absolutely, yeah, no, I'm gonna change it, but you're absolutely right. I know that. Well, you know, I had to deal with optics because of what I did. And we had to deal with Snell's law and all this other good stuff. You know, nobody, when I went to Hopkins, you know, the guy, one of the halls, Roland Hall, is in honor of Roland, who invented the diffraction grating. That was his thing. So he didn't need a prism. But that was his claim to fame. And the classic story about him is, well, Dr. Roland, what do you plan to do with your graduate students in physics? And his answer was, I plan to ignore them. But he was married to a gal who was a PhD in physiologic optics. And she was dealing with magnifiers and things like that. And she kept her maiden name, Dr. Louise Sloan. It was an interesting couple. You know, physics at Hopkins was fabulous. You couldn't avoid it. It was 5 days a week. And they showed us the classic experiment, you know, the light bending around a dense object. They shot rifles in the barrels of water. Some poor grad student set up 200 mouse traps to show us, you know, that stuff. But it was a 12-credit course. And we went from classic Newtonian physics to radioactivity in 1 year. And you were going like a bat out of hell. You were always behind. The thing that's mind-boggling is the guys who figured out electricity. You know, when you think about Maxwell's equations, what the state of our knowledge then, you figure, I still can't understand the damn things. Well, I listened to a video the guy did on mechanics. Yeah. Which is beyond my head. And it was interesting because he said, I worked with this for 30 years. And you know, this is his life, this is his job. You know, Brian Greene says that there's the classic story about Einstein and Eddington. And they were talking, and they said there's only 3 people in the world who understand quantum mechanics. And Eddington